Hi, in this presentation I want to talk about translations and manuscripts of the Bible. And we'll start here by looking at the process of composition, which is important to think about. How does the Bible actually come to be? It doesn't just fall from the sky. We've talked about how God has used humans to transmit His Word, and that Word is encapsulated within human ways of expressing themselves. So the first process really is an oral stage. So behind almost every biblical text, we can imagine that the stories were communicated orally and only later written down at a later point. I like to make the point that in Jesus' time, only about 5%, some people estimate up to 10%, but that's the most, of the population was literate. And so therefore, probably the least efficient way you could communicate something would be in the written form. This is why the oral form would be the dominant form of communication in the time of Jesus and before. But at some point, it becomes advantageous to write the text down, whether that's to archive the material or to retain the stories of the people who had witnessed the events. Or it might also be a function of the community itself having the means and the resources to, in fact, write down the stories. Writing was a technology. It was expensive technology. And so not everyone could read and write, obviously. And so therefore, it was a refined skill to be able to write. Even those who were literate, we were told, would hire scribes who had that good penmanship. All right. So the second stage would be the written stage. And so right away we see that the stories and texts are coming about through a process of, you might even say, of discernment. that the movement of the Spirit's working within this process in and of itself of what in fact is captured in a written form. But that's not the end of the story, because these texts are community documents. They're not to be imagined as just a lonely person in a room writing these texts down necessarily. They evolve over time. There's a process in which they're refined, and we can see this within the manuscript tradition. And so there's an editing stage as well. So the texts go through these three stages: the oral stage, the written stage, and then the edited stage. And this edited stage could involve corrections to the text, refinement of the language, as well as, well, gee, that's a great story, but there's these other details or elements that seem to be missing, so let's add those in. All right, so we've looked a little bit at that process when we looked at the documentary hypothesis, because in many ways that's a theory of composition which emphasizes how these different texts are coming together at that third stage, the edited stage. They might have been written at separate times, but they get put together in their final form through a process of combining sources. All right. Now, I'd like to talk about manuscripts themselves. First thing to note is we do not have any original copies of any of the books of the Bible. Our oldest complete version of the Bible comes from the 10th century. We do have books, individual books that pre-exist that date. The earliest texts we would have would be the Old Testament texts that come from the Qumran, come from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those would be the oldest texts that we have of any book of the Bible. So, yeah, we do have individual books that go back, but even those books, obviously, they're recounting events that predate the time of the Dead Seas, because that's basically the time of Jesus, about 200 BCE to about 100 CE. That's the date for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So any of the texts we have are coming pretty much from the time of Jesus and later. So we don't have, and even with the Gospels, we don't have any what are called autographs. That is the text written by the original author. Complete texts of a book come at a later date, because these texts obviously are made of papyri, generally, or out of sheepskins, other animal skins, but these obviously deteriorate over time. And so the texts get used and they get somehow torn or deteriorated. They get recopied. And so it's really the copies of the copies of the copies that we have in front of us. The other thing to notice is that that Bible that you're holding in your hand is a translation, therefore, of scholarly reconstruction of what might have been the original text. Because we don't have the autographs, what we have are a bunch of pieces of the earliest text we have, or pieces, some of them quite small, in fact, maybe a verse or not even that. And so what scholars do is they look at the earliest manuscripts that are available and try to figure out what would have been the earliest version of this text. Now that in itself is an interesting question, because since we know these texts have sort of this organic life to them, where they get formed and shaped by the experience of the community through the editing process, not just in the written process. When do you decide a text is fixed? When do you decide a text is done? Is a very important question to ask. But that said, even when you decide, okay, this is the time frame in which that text is in its final form, we might have textual variance about one verse versus another, how exactly it is to be phrased. So there will be some variations in language usage. Some of this is explained because a copyist, might make a mistake, and there's some pretty common ones. You might have experienced this in your younger days when you're trying to copy something down, and if there's a "the" in one line and a "the" in the next line, you can skip the information between the two "thes" as your eye moves from one line to the next, and you chop out a sentence worth of material just because you didn't realize that you were your eye picks up the new "the" even though it's not the one you had left off at. That could be one of the reasons. It could also be that a copyist decides to improve the text in front of him, its grammar. And so he wants to smooth it out. He sees that it's not as good as it could be. And then that becomes a question. Which version do you keep? The corrected version? Or do you keep the more awkwardly phrased grammar? There's a number of reasons why a copyist, whether by accident or intention, might change the text in front of him as he's recopying it. And so the challenge for scholars, who are called textual critics, is to look at all the evidence and make some determination about what's the most original version of this text. And in fact, you can, if you look at a Greek text or a Hebrew text, you'll notice footnotes at the bottom with all sorts of letters and numbers. Those are actually indicating what version, since these are all cataloged, these different variations of the text have been cataloged and given symbols to represent them, that the scholars have determined is more original, that they're basing their interpretation upon. And sometimes they'll also indicate, hey, we didn't go with this version, that they'll recognize that there's variations, and will alert the person in this apparatus that there's other readings of the text at this point. All right, so again, this is important to recognize, therefore, that the Bibles that we have in front of us are these scholarly reconstructions of what would be the most original text available. This, of course, raises a question for those who might want to take a more fundamentalist approach towards the Bible, since we really don't have those autographs, and might challenge a theology that's based on sort of a literal or fundamentalist model of inspiration. Later on, we'll talk about inspiration. Clearly, a number of questions are raised by this historical fact about the nature of our biblical text, and we'll address that when we look at the theory and theology of inspiration. What I want to point out here, what we have in front of us is both a Hebrew text and a Greek text taken from the Old Testament and New Testament, respectively. First thing, taking a look on the left of the Hebrew text, you will notice that we have letters, and then we have some symbols underneath those letters. Might be two dotted lines, or what might look like a T, or maybe something that looks a little bit like a J, or just a horizontal line. Those are actually vowels. Hebrew originally was written only in consonants, and only later, when people kind of lost their ability to speak Hebrew, that was no longer their first language, were the vowels added in by what we call the Masoretes, group of Jewish rabbis who inserted the vowels. Now, this might strike us as funny, but really, consonants carry the meaning of language. We've rediscovered this in our modern English context because notice texting. Texting also takes out the vowels, because you don't really need them. I remember when I first started teaching, I wanted to show the implications of not using vowels, and I'd write a sentence in English up on the blackboard with no vowels. And first time I did that, I was surprised that the students rather easily interpreted the meaning of the sentence. They were able to translate it, if you will, and by inserting the vowels. Well, a native speaker quickly eliminates what might be the possible constructions of different consonants. Now, it is possible that you can have some confusion by the fact that if you don't know the vowels, you can in fact misinterpret a word, right? So, the word, whatever word you want to talk about, you take the word C-L-L. Is that call? Is it coal? What would be the word that is meant there? Well, you usually can tell from context what word you're supposed to be is intended, but sometimes not. And so it is possible that translation errors can be made for that. And again, this is one of the works of textual critics, is to analyze the sentence, recognize the vowels are added later, and to make some assessment on whether or not the Masoretes correctly understood which vowels should be supplied. Because it can change the meaning of a sentence if you decide that different vowels are to be inserted within the word. Going over to the right picture of the text from the New Testament, this is Greek. Oh, before we leave the Hebrew text, just to let you know, you read from right to left in Hebrew. Here in Greek, as we do in English, you read from left to right. Now, first thing to notice on this text is that there are no spaces between the words. This was a way of saving parchment. Or papyri. Parchment would be any writing surface that's produced from animal skins that have been scraped, and there's a production process that goes through and sewn together. But obviously, that's an expensive medium to work with, and so too with papyri. Only certain kind of reeds can be used with papyri. They'd be weaved together and again processed. So since paper is expensive, you try to save space, and one way you do that is by not putting spaces between words. So again, you can take a look at this text, and again, here's one of the challenges for textual critics. How do I divide up these letters? Now here we do have vowels. Greek uses vowels, not just consonants. But now the new challenge, another challenge, is where is the beginning of this word and the end of this word? And again, most people who are well versed within Greek have no problem figuring out, well, the word, here's must be this word and here's that word, dividing up the string of letters into discrete words. But of course, there are opportunities and moments where a sentence can make, even within the context, make perfectly good sense to split the string of letters in different fashions and create different words which create different meanings. So again, this is part of the work of a textual critic. What's very interesting about the text we have in front of us is that you can see that a later, either the original copyist or a later copyist recognized there were some mistakes in the text. that the text had not been copied down correctly. So if you take a look at the 5th line from the left, on the left column, you can see that squeezed into the margin are some more letters because the original copyist had failed to add in the full word. He jumped from this what looks like a C there, and if you go to the front of the first line, to a K, right? And then even above that letter, the kappa or the K, you see what looks like a D and an E. So there's again some insertions here to indicate that some letters have been left out. And there's all sorts of symbols that are used, because if you look on the lower below the line, you can see what looks like the word Yah and different symbols and then dots underneath there and what have you. These are all ways that the copyist indicated, okay, a letter was left out or some letters were left out in this word, and there's a way in which a system was developed to indicate we should add these letters in, and what the mistake was. Now here's the big question for textual critics. Sometimes you recognize that in fact, some letters were left off, but other cases, adding the letters might change the meaning of the text. Maybe the original was right. Going back to that point that it's not always the case that somebody missed some letters. It just might be awkward Greek, the way it's originally written. And so therefore the corrections might be more geared towards smoothing the Greek. So how do you decide what's the right original form? Oftentimes these sorts of issues really only make minor differences in the text in terms of interpretation and the overall meaning of the text. But sometimes they can have some rather significant implications that have to be wrestled out and argued and some determination made. All right, then finally, once the original text is determined, there's another step, which is you have to determine how to translate this ancient text from either Hebrew or Greek into English. And I like to stress that every translation is an interpretation. That language, in trying to import one language into another language, automatically forces you to make some determinations about the meaning and sense of what's trying to be communicated and selecting the appropriate words. It's not like math. It's not 1 + 1 = 2, because language is more fluid than that, and sense and meaning is more complex than that. So I like to use this as an example. This is back a story that comes from the 1950s, early 60s. Back in the day when the fountain pen was the pen of choice. You didn't have ballpoint pens at that point. There was a problem with fountain pens in that since this was the early days of aircraft travel, when businessmen would put a fountain pen in their front pocket when they were in a nice white shirt as they head off to a business meeting, because of the change in air pressure, that pen would start to leak. It would, and so there you got off the plane, ready for your big business meeting, and you got a big blue spot shining forth from the front of your shirt. So Parker Pen, when it started to market its ballpoint pen, it had this logo or slogan: "It won't leak in your pocket and embarrass you." All right. And by the way, Parker Pen, good Wisconsin company, comes from Janesville, Wisconsin. Now, when they started to expand their market outside the United States into Mexico, they wanted to translate their slogan into Spanish, obviously, and so they came up with a translation, but they made a mistake. Now, this is in the 20th century. We can talk to people who speak Spanish, and yet they still get it wrong. What do they say? They said they thought the word embarazar in Spanish means to embarrass. I make that assumption myself. But in fact, embarazar does not mean to embarrass. In Spanish, it means to make pregnant. So Parker Pen was advertising in Mexico that their pens would not leak in your pocket and make you pregnant. Didn't know that could happen myself. Didn't know that was an issue. Probably one reason why the cells weren't so, they didn't skyrocket there in Mexico. And you can pull up example after example after example of these issues for multinational corporations when they try to translate their slogans or other materials. We've all encountered this when you try to read directions that might come with some sort of toy or a piece of furniture we have to put together, and you read the English. You're like, what is this? Clearly, sometimes what happens is people pull out a dictionary and they try to translate from whatever language that the product was produced in, and try to translate that into English, and they make all sorts of errors. So we know how this works. But here's, with these slogans, a couple examples that I like to always cite. So Coca-Cola, when they were trying to begin to sell this in China, came up with Ki Ku Ki La, which means bite the wax tadpole in Chinese. So they're trying to get something that sounded like Coca-Cola, and yet the meaning was problematic. Kind of a classic example was General Motors and the Nova, which was a famous model of a car. I don't know if they still build those or not, but when I was in high school, that was a pretty, seen as a pretty swift car to own. And but they weren't selling there in South America until the company realized, wait a minute, Nova in Spanish means no go. So then in that context, General Motors gave the car a different name. Another good one from Chinese is the Kentucky Fried Chicken slogan, "Finger looking good," came out in Chinese as "eat your fingers off," which didn't make it very attractive. All right, so now let's move a little bit to translations. Some of the standard translations. First off, probably the most famous Protestant translation is the King James translation into English, done in 1611. That really the Revised Standard Version, or what's more popular today would be the New Revised Standard, really is within the lineage of the King James. Clearly, both the Revised Standard and the New Revised Standard Version, they were informed by modern biblical scholarship. They're clearly a better translation than the King James in terms of more accurately conveying the meaning of the text. But all the same, they're in that lineage. Other texts that or translations that you might be familiar with the New American Standard Bible or the New International Version. In Protestant circles today, some people still use the King James. There's a whole theory there about the authority of the King James in some Protestant traditions. I'd say the two more popular versions, at least in the United States, amongst Protestants would be the New Revised Standard, which particularly amongst the mainline Protestant churches, I would say would favor that more. And most biblical scholars also tend to use the New Revised Standard for a couple of reasons, and or the New International Version. Amongst Catholics, the Douay Rheims, as you can see, which was done right around the time of the King James, and there's a lot of parallels, in fact, between the two texts. That would be, I guess you would say, the first dominant version of the Bible in English. And there's been a number since, obviously. But a couple that I point out here would be the Jerusalem Bible, which was done in 1966. The original Jerusalem Bible was actually a translation from Hebrew and Greek into French, and then from French into English. Now, the new Jerusalem Bible, the translation is done directly from the Hebrew and Greek into English. The Bible that we use the most commonly today would be in the U.S. would be the New American Bible. This translation was done by a group of biblical scholars starting in the 1930s and 40s. The bishops asked for a translation that would express American English, which has its variations, obviously, from British English. That translation was completed in the 1970s. What I don't have here, which I should add onto my slide, is that a thorough revision was done, called the New American Bible Revised Edition. So that's the title they give that. So New American Bible Revised Edition. So NABRE is how we refer to this newest translation that came out a number of years ago. I guess it's about 10 years. It came out in different stages. Different parts were translated over time, but I think the complete translation was completed, let's say about 15 years ago. I do have it there. 2010. Perfect. I should look at my own slides more carefully, because there I have the New American Bible Revised Edition. All these Bibles are usually, as we'll see on the next slide, have their own abbreviations. And then you have the Jewish Publication Society's translation of the, obviously just of the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, and that would be the dominant translation into English of today for the Jewish tradition. And here's that next slide, which one of the challenges that a translator has to face is, how do I take this text and fit it into the modern context? You can do this in a couple different ways. One would be, as you can see from this continuum here, word for word. So I just take the Greek or the Hebrew, and whatever it says there in Greek, I just translate it with an English word. This is a way to try to maintain fidelity to the original text. Problem is, sometimes you can maintain fidelity to the literal text without being faithful to the meaning of the text. Because, again, I can point you to those directions you read sometimes with the packaging of a piece of furniture, and you can say, well, literally I can understand what they're saying here, but really the sense of what they're trying to communicate is not accurate. And so you can say, well, to really give a sense of what this text is saying, I might add a word, or I might broaden out the sentence in some fashion to try to give it a flavor, or a way we might say it today. I experienced this when I was doing my dissertation. I had to translate some Greek, and then I had a good friend of mine translate some German into English. Had a good friend of mine who spent a number of years in Germany look at my translations, which I was very proud of. And he made some corrections, and I said, what was wrong with what I had? He goes, well, they just wouldn't say it that way. It's not the way they'd say it. And I pushed him. He couldn't really give me, not that my translation was wrong, it's just not how they say it. So again, this is sort of the challenge, right? How do you communicate something in the way we'd express things today, so that it's consistent with our mode of expression, and yet faithful to the text in its original expression? All right, so you can see the continuum here. This is, I think, a very helpful chart, because you can go all the way to paraphrase. I think it's important. You'll have people quoting to you from the Message, very popular Bible. That's not even a translation. What the person who wrote the Message did is, as well as the Living Bible, I think they use the same technique, is they simply put before them different translations. So these aren't even original translations. They simply looked at the other translations, and for every sentence they decide, this text translated this better than this. And that's how the Living Bible was done, I believe. Message, he did a whole different thing. He just read a bunch of translations and then expressed it in his own words, what he thought was the essence of the text. So, be real careful when people are quoting from the Living Bible or the Message, particularly the Message, because that's not even a translation. It's a personal reading of the text based upon having read a number of translations. But you can see you can move all the way from paraphrase to this thought for thought to word for word. And you can see along the continuum where different texts fall. The New American Bible, and I would say you can see that sort of on middle left side of the NAB. This chart does not have the New American Bible Revised Edition, but I would say it's about the same place. The Revised Edition of the NAB might move a little bit to the left. It went to a little more of a word-for-word sort of interpretation, something closer to the New Revised Standard Version, which is immediately to the NAB's left. But so that's, gives you a sense as you look at different texts. What kind of text is it? What kind of translation is it? All right, I hope that's helpful to get a sense of these texts and the translation of the text and the art of translation, how this all affects interpretation and understanding of the Bible. All right, talk to you later.